It's hard to believe, but I know it's true. I saw it on evening news.
Much confusion surrounds the commentary and reporting of a Muslim protest that turned violent in Sydney on September 15th. As a service to viewers, we've invited University Professor Andy Smokescreen to the studio to help set the record straight. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
This issue has arisen in response to a video called Innocence of Muslims, which is circulating on the internet. The factual underpinnings of the video, the spectacular production values and superb acting are all of the highest standard, yet US officials such as Hillary Clinton have tried to distance themselves and the US government from this video. Why have they done that?
It's perfectly clear that the US government has had no part to play in producing this propaganda video. The fact is that the US government makes anti-Muslim propaganda to a much higher standard.
So the US had nothing to do with it?
No, absolutely not. The US limits its role to simply telling bald-faced lies to justify mounting illegal invasions that kill well over 1 million people in the Muslim world in order to steal their resources, and leaves amateur video makers to simply draw their own conclusions.
The protest in Sydney turned out to be quite violent. This is what Prime Minister Julia Gillard had to say in response.
This is not the Australian way.
The Prime Minister is right. Clearly this was an un-Australian protest. If these people want an example of how to conduct a protest in the Australian way, they need look no further than the decent, peaceful, law-abiding events that took place in Cronulla a few years ago.
Julia Gillard said that this protest was not the Australian way. Can you tell us what is the Australian way?
Well, the Australian way to impose violence and mayhem is much more civilised. The Australian way includes locking up innocent refugees in detention centres until they get so depressed they commit suicide, or maintaining illegal occupations like in Afghanistan to prop up corrupt puppet governments made up of warlords and drug dealers.
Is that all there is to it?
Well, there are more subtle examples, such as when state governments pass undemocratic laws attacking civil liberties and then unleash armies of police to crush protesters who take to the streets.
One feature of this protest that has caused a lot of controversy was the image of a young child holding a sign calling for the beheading of all those who insult their prophet. Surely this demonstrates the character of the people involved.
Oh, absolutely. There's just no excuse for calling for beheading of people. Look, the way they should have gone about it was to become a rich white radio announcer and call for people to be put in chaff bags and dumped at sea. Then there would have been no problems at all.
But remember, this is children that we're talking about.
If you want to avoid blanket public condemnation of children doing outrageous things, you should follow the example of Israeli children who a few years ago wrote messages of hate on bombs designed to kill other children in Lebanon. That raised hardly an eyebrow.
Foreign Minister Bob Carr has come out and praised moderate Muslims and said that the protesters in Sydney are not representative of the majority of Muslims in Australia. Everyone knows what Muslims are like. Why has he said this?
Well, a certain amount of racism against Muslims helps the government get away with its attacks on workers' rights and living standards. But if Australian racism results in violence and disorder on the streets, that isn't so good for business. So he's trying to calm the situation down. Oh, and plus he's making a bidding for the gold medal in hypocrisy, given the role he played in inflaming hatred against Lebanese Muslims back in the 1990s.
In the first stages of the War on Terror, we heard a lot of talk about a clash of civilisations. Do you think that's what we're seeing now?
Oh yes, this is a small reflection in Australia of that ongoing clash of civilisations between the enlightened West and the backward Muslim world.
And what would you point to as an example of Australian civilisation to inspire the world?
Oh, that's easy, I think. Undoubtedly, the shining beacon of Australian civilisation is embodied in the comments by the world's richest woman, our own Gina Reinhardt, calling on Australian workers to be more like Africans and agree to work for $2 a day. What could be more civilised than that?
It's hard to believe, but I know it's true. I saw it on evening news.
And its workers are willing to work for less than $2 per day. Less than $2 per day.
What could be more civilised than that?